Today we're diving into something really fascinating, the intertwined stories of Japanese and Shanghainese people. Specifically, how they've moved between Shanghai and Japan, especially over the last, say, few decades.
It's a really dynamic picture.
Exactly. And we know you want to get the insights fast and thoroughly, so that's what we're aiming for. A quick but deep look at this relationship.
We'll be looking at the Japanese community in Shanghai, the Shanghainese who went over to Japan for work,
Right.
and then that more recent shift with Japanese professionals actually seeking opportunities in Shanghai.
Okay, so our mission here is really to unpack the why. What drove people? What were their experiences like? And, the bigger economic picture behind all this moving back and forth.
And the impact, too, the impact
Yeah.
on both cultures.
Definitely. And we're going to zero in on the Gubei area.
Right, Gubei. Shanghai actually has the second largest Japanese expat community in all of China. We're talking about 127,000 people.
Wow, that many.
Yeah, it's significant. A lot of them live in one particular area, Gubei. It really does. It shows how the community is kind of clustered and built a base there. Fundamentally, the idea was using Shanghai as let's say, a launch pad for their careers.
Okay.
It was about getting that valuable international experience and maybe even more importantly, picking up Mandarin Chinese. Those skills were, and still are, really valuable for career growth, whether they stayed in Shanghai long term or eventually went back to Japan. It was a strategic move for money.
That makes sense. And it's interesting because this connection, it isn't new, is it? The history goes back quite a way.
Oh, way back. The Japanese Consulate General in Shanghai. That opened in 1872.
1872, that's a long time.
It is. And that early presence really set the stage. By the 1870s, 1880s, you started seeing more Japanese ships, more Japanese companies setting up shop.
Right.
And then a Japanese club opened in 1908.
Shanghai's nickname, Magic City. It actually has Japanese roots, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It often gets translated as Magic City, sometimes even Demon City, depending on how you interpret it.
All right.
But the term itself was coined back in the 1920s by a Japanese author, Muramatsu Shofu. He visited Shanghai and was just struck by it.
And it wasn't just, wow, big city, was it? He saw something more complex.
Exactly. He was capturing this incredible mix, the glamour and glitz right alongside, real poverty and struggle, the intense blends, different cultures, East meeting West, and just the sheer pace of change. It was dazzling, but maybe a bit overwhelming too.
So that magic was kind of double-edged from the start, intense contradictions.
Precisely. It perfectly captured that intoxicating, sometimes jarring reality of Shanghai back then. And you could argue that perception, that sense of dynamism and allure, still kind of echoes today, even as cities change dramatically. So this community feel has been building for well over a century.
So it's not just a recent boom, it's got deep roots.
Definitely. And that established presence naturally led to meeting places for people to live, which brings us to this really interesting phase of foreign sale housing.
Ah, yes, let's talk about that. Foreign sale housing back in the 90s in Shanghai. This sounds like a key development. What exactly was it?
So this was a specific category of property developed by both local Chinese and foreign companies. The land was leased, importantly.
Okay.
And they were targeted primarily at, overseas Chinese, foreigners, and people from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan.
And the key thing was you needed foreign currency to buy them, right?
That was the defining feature.
Yeah.
You had to pay in foreign currency. It was a clear strategy to bring in international money and, international residents.
Makes sense. And I gather the marketing really played up this international angle.
Oh, heavily. The advertising was all about international standards.
The international standards.
Okay.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant everything from the apartment design itself to the, quality of the building materials, even the property management.
Okay.
So you'd see ads talking about household design meeting international standards or using internationally renowned kitchen and bathroom brands. It signaled a definite step up in quality for Shanghai's housing market at the time.
It sounds like a world away from what was maybe typical back then. And Gubei, that area you mentioned, is often cited as a prime example.
Gubei really became the poster child for this. The big selling points back in the 90s were things we kind of take for granted now, like apartments being fully furnished and ready to move into, and professional property manager.
Yeah.
But the specifics are telling, like imported air conditioners, Hitachi ones, Kohler bathrooms, intercom systems.
Stuff that wasn't standard elsewhere?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Plus things like 24-hour security patrols, video surveillance. Compare that to the much more basic housing, often with shared facilities that many locals had. It was a huge contrast.
And presumably this all came at a premium price.
Oh, absolutely. In 1995, you were looking at around $1,300 US per square meter in Gubei.
Okay.
By 1996, that had jumped to $2,000 US.
Wow.
And you saw the demand early on. The very first foreign sale commercial building, Jinming Building in Hongqiao, finished in 92. It sold out almost immediately.
So there was serious interest.
Definitely. The whole pre-sale market for this kind of housing just exploded in Shanghai in the early 90s.
It gives you a real sense of Shanghai opening up. Were these developments concentrated in specific areas?
Yes, mostly in Chaining and Zuhui districts. Gubei in Chaining became the most famous, sort of the hub. And the names of some of these early places are quite evocative. Gem, Diamond, Golden Lion, Golden Horse, Golden Dragon, Golden Elephant Apartments. And then you also had ones with European names like Rome Garden, Lion Garden, Athens Garden.
It really sounds like they were selling an international lifestyle, not just an apartment. We actually have a personal story about this, don't we? Someone named Zhu Yajin.
Yes. She bought a two-bed place in Gem apartment back in 1992 for 210,000 RMB.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is the price difference. The base price for foreign buyers was $420 US per square meter. For domestic buyers, it was 1640 RMB.
A clear difference.
And not just the price. The units for foreign sale came kitted out with imported appliances, water heaters, stainless steel gas stoves, things the domesticists didn't necessarily have.
So different specs as well as different prices. How did she feel about buying it, looking back?
Well, she mentioned they were built to what they call foreign standards, then often bigger kitchens and bathrooms, maybe slightly smaller bedrooms.
Interesting layout difference.
Yeah. And she noted the overall standard was just higher, better maintained. Apparently, people later told her she had real foresight buying it back then, recognizing the value.
And prices did go up significantly, like that diamond apartment example.
Right. Diamond apartment went from over $500 US a square meter in 89 to nearly $1,300 by 94. So more than doubled in 5 years.
It really paints a picture of rapid change. Now, this interaction in the early 90s, it wasn't just foreigners coming to Shanghai. There was also this big wave of Shanghainese people going the other way to Japan looking for work.
Exactly. As interactions increased, so did awareness of opportunities abroad, especially Japan.
Okay.
And in the early 90s, lots of Shanghainese were hearing these stories, from relatives or friends who'd gone to Japan and come back.
Come back with?
Well, with new electronics, things people really wanted then. And just a sense that they'd made good money. There was even a specific Shanghainese phrase for it. Bafon?
Bafon. What does that mean?
It literally means something like to rake in money or scrape up cash. It captured that feeling of going abroad specifically to earn.
The lure of making money, but it sounds like the reality wasn't always easy for those who went.
That's a really important point. When researchers looked into this later, they found many people who went in the early 90s were actually quite reluctant to talk about it.
Reluctant? Why?
Some described it as feeling like returning from a battlefield. It suggests it was incredibly tough. Hard work, long hours, maybe difficult conditions.
Not just a simple Japan boom then.
Not for everyone, no.
Yeah.
They felt the popular idea didn't really capture the struggle involved.
And the financial numbers really show the pull, but also hint at the pressure, I suppose.
Absolutely. Take Zhang Cheng. He worked in a printing factory in Shanghai, earning maybe 75 to 150 RMB a month.
Okay, pretty low.
In Japan, doing often very demanding work, he managed to save around 7,000 to 8,000 RMB per month.
Wow, that's a staggering difference.
It really shows the sheer economic incentive, doesn't it? Why people would endure hardship.
It certainly does. And Zukiwa's story adds another layer.
Yes. Zukiwa started on an even lower salary, maybe 200 RMB a month. And he went to Japan already in debt from his education costs.
So extra pressure from the start.
Huge pressure, which meant he worked incredibly hard. Multiple jobs, really long hours. He talked about earning 1,000 to 1,500 yen an hour in convenience stores or doing logistics work overnight.
Tough shifts.
Very. But he said he could earn his entire month's Shanghai salary in just 2 days in Japan.
2 days?
Yeah. And his total monthly earnings could actually be much higher than what recent Japanese university graduates were making at the time.
That's quite something. And Lu Shubing, he was earning a bit more in Shanghai.
He was, around 300 RMB a month, which was decent for Shanghai then. But even he quickly saw that just a couple of days' work in Japan matched his whole month's pay.
It must have really shifted his perspective on wages.
It did. He mentioned how people back in Shanghai would argue over tiny pay rises, which seemed absurd after seeing the potential earnings in Japan. He even told this story about cleaning toilets for 8,500 yen a day. It just showed that even jobs may be considered undesirable paid incredibly well compared to back home.
These stories are powerful. But we also have a counterpoint, right? A letter that paints a less rosy picture.
Yes, and it's crucial. A letter from a husband in Japan to his wife in Shanghai, written in 1992. It's much more cautious.
What did he say?
He talked about how incredibly hard it was to find any work in Tokyo, even basic stuff like washing dishes. He said most people who'd arrived around the same time hadn't found jobs at all.
So the reality was hitting hard.
Very hard. He described a lot of disappointment, people struggling just to earn enough to start paying back the money they borrowed to get there.
Right, the debts were a big factor.
Exactly. And he stressed his own earnings were nowhere near the exaggerated stories they'd heard before leaving. He called the money earned in Japan blood and sweat money. Hard-earned.
That's a vital dose of realism. It wasn't a guaranteed path to riches.
Not at all. Experiences clearly varied hugely.
Okay, let's jump forward now to around 2009. Things seem to start shifting again, but in the other direction.
That's right. We begin to see Japanese individuals actively choosing to move to Shanghai for work.
What was driving that?
For Miss A, a key factor was wanting to use her Chinese language skills. She was fluent.
Leveraging that skill.
Exactly. And this was happening around the time Japan's economy was struggling, facing recession. Shanghai looked more dynamic, offering potentially better prospects, especially in fields like finance, which was her area.
But there was a bit of anxiety tied to this move too, wasn't there? About staying too long.
Yes, that's interesting. There was this concern about becoming, let's say, out of touch with the Japanese job market if they stayed in Shanghai for too many years. Less employable back home.
Right. Did Mrs. A go back?
She did eventually decide to return to Japan. But crucially, the experience and the network she built in Shanghai actually helped her. She got a job back in Japan through those Shanghai connections.
So it worked out leveraging the Shanghai experience.
It did. It shows how linked the two economies were becoming.
It really does. But not without potential pitfalls. We have a warning from a consultant, Kiyomi Sasaki.
Yes. Sasaki offers a note of caution about this Shanghai dream for Japanese professionals. While there are opportunities, especially if you have good Chinese skills,
Right.
but there are risks. A key one she points out is the possibility of abrupt dismissal. Maybe not the same job security as they might expect, similar perhaps to temporary work situations in Japan.
So be aware of the potential instability.
Exactly. You need to manage expectations about long-term security.
And Sasaki breaks down the Japanese workers in Shanghai into roughly 3 groups, which is helpful.
Right. First, you have long-term business owners. Initially, maybe running restaurants for expats, but more recently, moving into things like consulting. The business scene matured.
Okay, the entrepreneurs.
Second, the classic expats employees sent over by their Japanese companies. They usually get the full package. Housing allowance, school fees for kids, maybe a hardship allowance.
The well-supported group.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
And the third group is maybe the most interesting recent trend.
Which,
Younger Japanese people, often just out of university, coming to Shanghai first, then looking for a job locally.
without a job lined up beforehand.
Often, yes. They're attracted by the sheer number of Japanese companies there. And they might be more willing to accept lower average salaries than they'd get in Japan.
Why would they do that?
Because the cost of living in Shanghai is, or at least was, significantly lower.
Right. Do we have numbers on those salaries?
Sasaki mentions around 141,000 yen a month for those who don't speak Chinese, maybe up to 212,000 yen for those who do.
Okay.
But then she gives this example. Renting a decent apartment, a 2 LDK, in Shanghai might cost only around 21,000 yen a month.
That is much cheaper than Tokyo.
Exactly. So your purchasing power, even on a lower nominal salary, could actually be quite good. That lower living cost is a major draw for this group.
It makes Shanghai seem much more accessible, especially for younger people starting out. But it's not always a smooth path for them either, is it? The story of Mrs. B.
Right, Miss B's story is quite poignant. She first came as a student and stayed on, got a job at a trading company. Initially, it felt like a good way to ride out the downturn in Japan, get some international experience. Now she's nearing her 40s,
Yeah.
and she's feeling anxious. Anxious about her age, her job prospects, both if she stays in Shanghai and if she tries to go back to Japan.
Kind of caught in the middle.
Exactly. She described feeling trapped, uncertain about her long-term career path in either place. It highlights that feeling of being caught between two worlds, professionally and culturally.
That feeling of limbo sounds tough. And the existence of websites specifically for finding jobs in Shanghai for Japanese speakers, like Sola Kamomeko, points to this trend too.
Yes, that site gets a lot of traffic, especially apparently from Japanese women in their 30s.
Interesting demographic.
And most of the jobs listed, they're from Japanese companies operating in Shanghai looking to hire Japanese staff locally.
So Japanese companies are actively recruiting Japanese people in Shanghai rather than sending them from Japan.
That seems to be a growing trend, largely for cost reasons.
Oh, makes sense.
Takatoshi Yajima from Sola Kamomeko points this out. Hiring locally in Shanghai is just cheaper for the companies than paying for the full expat package, the housing, the allowances for someone sent from Japan.
So they cut personnel costs but still get employees with the language skills and cultural background they want?
Precisely. It's an economic adaptation by the companies.
A clear sign of how business is evolving. That popular Chinese drama, 30 Only. When it went to Japan, they actually renamed it Shanghai Women's Stories.
Huh. That tells you something right there, doesn't it? About the perception, the fascination with Shanghai and Japan. Back in '96, you had maybe just over 57,000 Japanese residents in all of China.
Okay.
By 2011, that number had shot up to over 163,000, almost tripled. It signals Shanghai becoming this really key place for Japanese business.
And when we talk about where in Shanghai, Gubei keeps coming up. It's the main spot, right? With estimates around 30,000 Japanese residents living there.
Yeah, Gubei is definitely the primary residential hub.
Yeah.
And it's very visible. You walk around, and the amount of Japanese signage is just striking. Restaurants, shops, services.
You hear Japanese spoken on the streets?
Routinely, yeah. And you got the international schools that cater specifically to Japanese kids. It all builds this very distinct identity for the neighborhood. It's that ethnic economy in action, not just businesses, but a whole support system.
Like a little Tokyo, but woven into Shanghai. Authentic Japanese cuisine there.
Oh, absolutely. They mention things like incredibly fresh mackerel sushi, delicate sakura shrimp, even quite unique dishes like yuzu noodles with crab leg and yam puree. Sounds amazing.
It really does. High-end stuff.
Yeah, but also the everyday comfort food, simmered rice, proper miso soup, things that make it feel like home. And it's not just for the Japanese expats anymore. Lots of local Shanghainese are drawn to these places too, looking for that authentic taste.
That makes sense. Good food is good food. And beyond restaurants, what about shopping? Takashimaya department store gets mentioned.
Right, the big Japanese department store. It seems geared towards that mid to high-end market, offering quality Japanese brands and goods. Apparently, there were rumors it might close a few years back, but it's still going strong.
Interesting. So that's one end. What about, like, everyday groceries?
Well, then you've got places like Apita, a Japanese supermarket, mentioned as being in the Hongqiao area, which is nearby. That sounds more like your typical supermarket experience.
Ah, okay. So more affordable everyday stuff, like those pre-packaged bento boxes you see.
Exactly. Bentos, regular groceries, maybe even discounted items later in the day. It shows there's a whole spectrum of retail catering to different needs and budgets within the community.
So from luxury goods to daily essentials, it's all there. And this isn't just about buying stuff, is it? There are deeper cultural links too.
Definitely. Shanghai hosts a lot of Sino-Japanese cultural events. The Shanghai International Film Festival, for instance, which has apparently screened a significant number of Japanese films every year since way back in 2007.
So it reinforces Shanghai's image as a key place for that cultural exchange. Okay, let's dig into the why. Why Shanghai specifically? We know about the Gubei enclave, the food, the shops, but what are the bigger drivers pulling people there?
Well, it seems to be a mix of factors, some pushing people from Japan, others pulling them towards Shanghai.
The push from Japan. That would be the economic situation there, right? The lost decades we hear about.
Exactly. That period of relative economic stagnation definitely encouraged Japanese companies and individuals to look overseas for better opportunities. And Shanghai, booming at the time, looked very attractive. Massive population, huge consumer market, powerful manufacturing base.
And the trade links were exploding, right? It's physically close, isn't it? Like a 2-hour flight from Tokyo?
Yeah, super convenient, makes it easy to go back and forth, maintain ties.
And then there's the vibe of the city itself. Shanghai versus, say, Beijing.
Right. This often describes Shanghai as feeling more open, more relaxed, maybe a bit less formal or political than Beijing. Someone drew the analogy of New York City versus Washington, D.C.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. More freewheeling, maybe more international in feel.
Kinda, yeah. That atmosphere seems to appeal to many expats. Plus, you have the practical stuff. Compared to Tokyo, the cost of living was lower. Shanghai's metro system is incredibly efficient. It's always been a place where international interaction was normal. Gubei new area was actually designed in the 90s as Shanghai's first big international district. The idea was to attract foreign talent and investment.
So it was planned to be international from the start.
Initially, yes, it had a mix of nationalities. After around 2003, things started to shift, and Gubei became much more distinctly Japanese. Two main phases. First, the emergence phase from the 90s up to about 2002. During this time, the Japanese population was growing, so demand for Japanese goods and services was definitely there.
But it was hard for Japanese people to actually start businesses then.
Right. Chinese immigration and investment rules were tighter, so you mostly had local Chinese businesses trying to fill the gap.
And the Japanese residents weren't always satisfied.
Apparently not always. Complaints about authenticity, language issues, service styles not quite right. So many people just brought stuff back from trips to Japan.
Okay, so that was phase one. What changed for phase two, the development phase from 2003 onwards?
Two big things, really. First, China relaxed its foreign investment laws around 2004. That made it much easier for Japanese entrepreneurs to set up shop themselves.
Ah, so direct Japanese ownership became more feasible.
Exactly. And second, you saw more Chinese individuals getting involved who had experience in Japan. Maybe they'd lived or worked or studied there.
So they understood the market better. They knew what Japanese customers were looking for.
Precisely. They knew that the food, the service expectations, the language, the kind of ambiance people wanted, they could create more authentic experiences, often hiring Japanese staff too. This combination really fueled the growth of the Gubei we see now.
It's a fascinating convergence. Policy changes, Japanese investment, returning Chinese nationals with specific skills, all coming together. So what are the key features, highlights about this Gubei ethnic economy today?
Okay, several things. First, it's very geographically anchored. It really depends on the Japanese living in Gubei.
Makes sense.
Location, location,
Yeah.
location.
Second, the primary target audience is still overwhelmingly the Japanese population, both in Gubei and those who travel there from other parts of Shanghai.
Right, serving their own community first and foremost.
Third, that mixed ownership point we touched on. You see Japanese owners, Chinese owners, and often partnerships. But interestingly, the workforce is predominantly Chinese, even in Japanese-owned businesses.
It's different from some other ethnic enclaves globally, isn't it? Where maybe more co-ethnics work in the businesses.
It is, yeah. It seems to be a distinct feature here.
Okay, what kinds of businesses are we talking about? It's really comprehensive. Education is huge. The main Japanese school, other international schools, after-school cram schools, kindergartens, then food retail specialty shops, supermarkets, food service, tons of restaurants, bars, cafes,
Wow.
and other services too. Clinics with Japanese-speaking doctors, real estate agents catering to expats, massage places, hair salons, even Japanese video rental stores. It's a whole ecosystem.
Truly self-sufficient, almost. Why do people start these businesses? What motivates them?
For the Japanese entrepreneurs, it's often a mix. Maybe frustration with Japan's economy, seeing opportunity in China, the growing Japanese population, creating a market, growing number of non-Japanese customers, local Chinese, other expats who are attracted by the quality or authenticity of the Japanese offerings.
You mentioned the workforce being mostly Chinese. We noted something about limited job creation for Japanese residents.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Unlike, say, historical immigrant communities where ethnic businesses were a major source of jobs for newcomers, that doesn't seem to be the primary function here.
So Japanese people working in these Gubei businesses are often in what kinds of roles?
More often in management or specialist roles. It's seen perhaps as gaining valuable international experience rather than just finding any job within the community. It reflects that many Japanese are there on corporate assignments anyway.
So it serves consumer needs and provides strategic roles, but isn't the main employment engine for the expats themselves. And Gubei remains the hub, even if Japanese people live elsewhere in Shanghai now.
Seems so. Even with Japanese residents spreading out to Pudong or Suhui, Gubei is still the go-to place for these specific Japanese businesses and services. People will travel across the city to get there.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Sure. There's one, a secondhand goods store that started in 2002. Basically bought and sold used stuff from expats leaving Shanghai. Really tapped into that transient lifestyle, you know. Later they added new items too.
Smart. Catering to the constant churn of expats. What else?
There's a tea shop that opened in 2007. What's interesting is the owner is Chinese, apparently an expert in Chinese tea culture. But their main customers are Japanese. And they even offer Chinese cultural classes.
Huh. So the cultural exchange is flowing both ways within that little economy. Fascinating.
Yeah. And then there's a kindergarten set up in 2008, specifically providing a Japanese language environment for young kids. That's obviously meeting a huge need for families wanting to maintain their language and culture.
Absolutely crucial for families planning to return to Japan eventually. Maybe one more.
Okay, how about a Chinese language school run by a Chinese person who'd spent a lot of time working in Japan? Initially, they taught Chinese mainly to Japanese housewives, but then they adapted and started offering Japanese tutoring to Chinese students.
Shows real adaptability to the market. These examples really bring that ethnic economy concept to life. Okiya agree, addressing those rumors about foreigners leaving Shanghai. How does that square with this picture of a thriving Gubei?
Right, that directly counters the narrative that there was this big exodus happening. It looked at data from around 2014, 2015, and found the overall foreign resident number in Shanghai was pretty stable, around 170,000.
So no mass departure according to their figures.
No. Maybe a slight dip from the year before, but nothing dramatic considered normal fluctuation.
What about Gubei specifically?
Some changes within Gubei might be happening. Saw less activity because people and businesses moved to newer, perhaps fancier areas.
So internal shifts, maybe increased competition rather than people leaving altogether?
That seems to be the argument. The overall foreign population in Gubei itself estimated at over 30,000, with foreigners being about half, and Japanese and Koreans making up a big chunk of that was holding relatively steady. The Gubei community relies so heavily on Japanese companies sending expats over. It's somewhat vulnerable. If Japanese investment in Shanghai slows down, or economic conditions in Japan change drastically.
Then the flow of expats might decrease, which impacts the whole ethnic economy that serves them.
Exactly. The economy's future is tied quite closely to the residential community's health. It could decline or transform if those external factors change significantly. I think the key thing is how unique this community is. It wasn't really formed out of displacement like some historical ethnic enclaves. It was driven more by opportunity, by lifestyle choices. And it's characterized by this interesting mix of Japanese and Chinese entrepreneurship, mainly serving the Japanese expats, but deeply connected to Shanghai's broader economic story and its international identity. There's always so much more to learn.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. It's really clear that the flow of people between Japan and Shanghai has been incredibly dynamic.
Driven by economics, by personal dreams, by global shifts. Yeah, that big wave of Shanghainese going to Japan in the early 90s, chasing financial opportunity. And then later, especially post-2009, you see this other current, Japanese professionals looking toward Shanghai for their careers. It's definitely not just a one-way street. It's this ongoing exchange, constantly shaped by money, ambition, and circumstance.